What's going on, guys? It's Cimoooooooo. So today I'm bringing to you a hand trap analysis for the October 2018 format. I love bringing you guys these videos right around the time we get a new format after a ban list, because since formats tend to change rather rapidly, especially when we get a new ban list, that kind of affects the viability of specific hand traps. So if you're going to a regional or a YCS, I want you guys to be prepared knowing what the better hand traps are against the overall metagame. So for the purposes of this video, we're going to be talking about the hand traps against the top 5 meta decks, which you can check out that video right here. But ultimately, we're going to be talking about Sky Striker, GoKey, Altergeist, True Draco, and a little bit of Strix Star as well. Those, in my opinion, are the top 5 most represented decks that you're going to be seeing the most, so you want to be prepared knowing which hand traps are going to do the best. But before we get into it, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss a single upload. And if you really love this type of video or any of the other content that I produce, then consider supporting me on Patreon or becoming a YouTube channel member, because it's thanks to people like Ermac792 that I'm able to bring you this content on a daily basis. So if you're interested, hit the join button down below or check out the links in the description. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. So we're going to go ahead and start off alphabetically with Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring. Now, Ash Blossom's kind of like revered as one of the best hand traps just ever printed, and for good reason. There are some instances where Ash Blossom isn't the best in some situations. However, the cards and kind of just the breadth at which Ash Blossom can be applied against is so powerful, and there's cards that Ash Blossom can stop that no other card in the game is effective against, and that's what makes the card so powerful. So looking at it in the context of Sky Strikers, Ash Blossom's pretty good considering the deck does a ton of searching. I mean, there's some instances where if you just hit a Sky Striker engage on turn 1 with Ash Blossom, if they have no follow-up play, their deck has very few starter cards, especially now with Hornet Drones going to 1, so if you hit that engage and they don't have a Ray or anything else to follow up with it, they might just end their turn, and Ash Blossom might just be able to put the pressure on them and allow you to just take control of that game right before your turn has even begun. Even when you get into the mid-game, though, Ash Blossom's good against Engage because now they're probably going to be getting that +1 off of the Engage, so denying that 2-for-1 with your Ash Blossom can be very good. Yeah, sure, Engage may not be once per turn, and they can recur it with stuff like Kagari, but depending on the circumstances, if you can stem the bleeding, Ash Blossom can be a very effective tool in that matchup. Moving on to GoKey, Ash Blossom is particularly strong against GoKey because it's one of the few hand traps that can actually play under a card like Magical Midfield Breaker, and a lot of GoKey players are starting to play this because it pretty much shuts down like 75 to 80% of the hand traps that would stop the deck anyway, so having Ash Blossom is invaluable. Hitting that Isolde with Ash Blossom means that, you know, if they don't have the extender, it's kind of just going to be game over, and they're just going to be sitting on that Isolde, and it's not really going to have them set up any sort of board whatsoever, and you're going to be able to power over that rather easily. Even with something like Armageddon Knight or Dark Grepher or Vision Hero Vion, these are some of the new cards that the Dark GoKey or the Dark Warrior decks are taking advantage of so they can have a 1 or 2 card extra link. Hitting Ash Blossom on that so they can't get Malicious into their graveyard can actually just stop their play entirely, because then they just committed to their normal summon and they don't have that extender to follow up with it. It's going to be looking pretty good for you. Also, the fact that all the GoKey monsters have effects that activate in the grave to add cards to hand, depending on the circumstances, you could potentially stop something like Rematch getting to their hand. There's a lot of really cool things Ash Blossom can do. Against Altergeist, Ash Blossom is not the best card. There's a few instances, like, you could maybe use it on a multi-faker, but even then, it's not, like, that good. There's not really a good instance for Ash Blossom in this particular matchup, so you kind of just have to, you know, really just read the field and kind of see where it makes sense to utilize it. You're probably going to maybe siding these copies out maybe during your games 2 and 3, just so you don't see it as frequently. There are definitely better cards. Against True Draco, however, there are so many draw cards in that deck that you're definitely going to want to have that Ash Blossom, stopping Diagram or Desires or any of the True Draco monster effects, or hell, even stopping something like Card of Demise basically prevents them from getting back into the game whatsoever, and is probably one of the best uses of Ash Blossom in the entire format. So definitely something to keep in mind there. Against Strix Star, it's alright too. I mean, stopping a Light Stage search, a Candina search, that deck does a fair bit of searching as well, so you're going to want to have your Ash Blossoms for that matchup too. Now this brings us on to the next hand trap, Droll and Lockbird. Now, Droll and Lockbird's one of those weird hand traps that kind of goes in and out of formats depending on what's going on, and Droll saw a lot of play last format when GoKey was starting to become the most represented deck, because stopping GoKey at all costs was kind of the name of the game, and Droll was very effective at doing that. However, Droll has this very odd dynamic that by playing it, you're taking a -1, right? You're just discarding a card, your opponent's not losing anything, they're just kind of delayed for one turn. So sometimes that can be enough, but you're not taking anything away from them, and that's kind of where Droll falls short in a lot of circumstances. So take a look at a deck like Sky Striker. You know, using Droll and Lockbird against that deck doesn't really do a whole lot, because yes, you're stopping them from searching for a turn, but the deck is just so good at being able to grind out in particular matchups that it doesn't really matter if it has to take a turn off, because it's not like it's going to kill you the following turn anyway, because the deck can't really output a lot of damage. So the deck is able to afford that luxury of being able to wait and being hit by Droll. That's why in the OCG, Droll and Lockbird actually was not too popular, because it was the strongest deck in their format and didn't really do anything. Not to mention in your Altergeist matchup, which was their second most popular deck, Droll and Lockbird is absolutely worthless because that deck does barely any searching at all. It's still pretty decent against GoKey though. I mean, the deck is still going to be pumping out boards, so if you need to slow down GoKey, or if like your locals or regionals has a ton of GoKey players, playing Droll might not be a bad idea. It's also pretty decent against Draco. Draco can do a fair bit of searching just depending on how many draw cards they get. Kind of Strix Star, Sky Striker in that same light, but again, these decks are kind of a little bit slower. They don't have as much offensive capabilities. Draco especially, because it's a stun deck. These decks can afford to just take a turn off, and they're kind of okay with that. So again, depending on your meta, Droll is one of those things you definitely want to keep in mind. You really have to use Droll wisely, otherwise it's just going to be a dead card more often than not. Now this brings us on to Effect Veiler. Now, Effect Veiler starts to see play every once in a while. You know, it kind of got power crept out by Infinite Impermanence, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Effect Veiler's not too bad of a card, though. It's pretty decent against Sky Striker. You can stop some of the effects depending on, you know, what you're trying to achieve. You can stop stuff like Kagari, Shizuku, just depending on the circumstances, and that's not too bad. Possibly even a Hayate before it goes into the battle phase. You know, against GoKey, it's actually pretty decent because you can stop, you know, both effects of Isolde, so that's pretty nice, and you can stop just really anything else GoKey's gonna throw at you. Against something like Altergeist, yeah, it's not like the best card. It's okay. I would say it's probably average at best. Draco, it can be decent because depending on the circumstance, if they already have monsters on the field, you know, I wouldn't say it's ideal, but preventing them from getting an additional card isn't bad, but I feel like they're just gonna churn through so much advantage anyway that Effect Veiler isn't really going to be enough. And then when you have a deck like Strix Star or Strix Star Sky Striker, or really any Strix Star variant, again, stopping something like Candina can be nice, but when they can tag it out with something like Licorice and dodge the Veiler, you know, it's not exactly the best. So again, just depending on the circumstances, Veiler can be okay. That's really up for you to decide. That's going to go ahead and bring us on to Ghost Belle. Now, Ghost Belle has started to see quite a rise in popularity because Ghost Belle is a pretty decent card, being able to stop a lot of cards that, you know, not a lot of other cards really do, very similar to something like Ash Blossom, just in a different way. Look at a deck like Sky Striker. I mean, you can stop stuff like Kagari, which is a really big deal. I mean, preventing that add back could potentially really hinder what they're able to do in a given turn. Against GoKey, you can stop something like GoKey Rematch, which is absolutely massive. That can pretty much put a complete halt to any of their plays. You could stop Monster Reborn. You can stop Soul Charge. I think that's probably one of the biggest ones because Soul Charge, although it is a one-of, it's one of the craziest comeback cards in the entire game. And realistically, if your opponent has it, you probably lost, so having Ghost Belle can prevent any sort of comeback mechanic from your opponent from being able to take control of that game. It can also stop stuff like Called by the Grave, and I think this is one of the biggest applications of Ghost Belle because a lot of decks are running Called by the Grave now, especially with GoKey running around still, and also with Sky Striker because people want to get Ray out of the graveyard so it doesn't constantly recur itself every single time one of the Mech Link monsters would get destroyed. However, having a card like Ghost Belle can be very good because it can basically be an insurance policy so that whatever other hand trap you're playing, you can ensure that it's going to go through because Ghost Belle can negate that called by the grave. So something to keep in mind. It's something that a lot of players are experimenting with, and judging by the price tag, it's definitely something that's seeing quite a surge in popularity. Now this is going to bring us on to Ghost Ogre. Now Ghost Ogre has always been one of those pretty decent hand traps. It's usually like in third place, kind of behind Ash, and you know, depending on the format, whatever other hand trap would be in second place, but Ghost Ogre is a pretty solid option. I mean, against Sky Striker, you can hit multi-roll. I think that's a really big deal. Stopping the multi-roll pretty much means they're not going to recur all this advantage that they otherwise wouldn't have, and it's free, so just having the Ghost Ogre to trade that 1-for-1 is insane for that specific matchup. Against your GoKey matchup, you can stop Summon Sorcerers, which can completely stop them in their tracks, or even Firewall Dragon, so that's really neat. It is susceptible to being stopped by a card like Midfield Breaker, but again, if they don't have it, Ghost Ogre is going to be free range. Against Altergeist, Ghost Ogre is actually really good, because against opposing cards like Protocol or Personal Spoofing, these cards are basically going to be -1s for the Altergeist player because they have to shuffle the cards back as cost, and by doing so, by hitting them with Ogre, then they're going to take a pretty significant loss in card advantage and lose a lot of tempo. So Ogre can be very effective against your Altergeist matchup, very similarly to Draco as well. Ogre is just insane, being able to hit Diagram, being able to hit any of the continuous spells, that can be very huge. Hell, even hitting the monsters sometimes and just getting them off the board can really set them back a lot and allow you to go in for that kill. Ogre's always been good against Draco, and in this format, it's still no exception. Against your Strix Star matchups, though, Ogre's pretty terrible. I mean, there's not really any good targets to hit with it, but I'd say overall, it's pretty good against 4 out of the 5 top decks. I would say Ogre's definitely a very decent option right now. This brings us on to Ghost Reaper and Winter Cherries. Now, Cherries is one of those weird cards because sometimes even if you Cherries an opponent, they can still win the game, which is kind of odd, but it's one of those cards that can possibly just end the game outright if your opponent plays into it. Against your Sky Striker matchup, you can hit stuff like Kagari, which is really huge. Hell, even Hayate or Shizuku maybe in later turns, but I'd say Kagari is probably the biggest one. Against your GoKey matchup, you can hit Isolde, you can hit Firewall, Summon Sorcerers. There's so many viable targets in that matchup, and again, what's nice, it plays around Midfield Breaker, so that's very important. Then you've got matchups like Altergeist and Draco, where Ghost Reaper's absolutely worthless, and against Strix Star, again, it's pretty dead. I mean, I guess you could maybe hit like a Nightmare or maybe like a Firewall, kind of just a generic Link monster, but Reaper's not going to be good in those matchups. But because Reaper's good against the top 2 decks, it's something you might want to think about just because it's the 2 decks you're going to be seeing more than probably anything else, but it does depend on your local metagame. Now next up, I want to talk about Infinite Impermanence. Now, Infinite Impermanence has a lot of similarities to Effect Veiler, but one of the strongest advantages is that it does not lose to Called by the Grave, and I think that's very important. In addition to that, though, you can also use Infinite Impermanence to kind of shut down your opponent's floodgates because it will negate spells and traps in the same column where it's activated if it were set first rather than activating it from your hand, let's say on like turn 1. So there's a lot more flexibility to a card like this compared to Effect Veiler, and it's also not once per turn, so you can open multiples of it, and you can feel pretty good about it. Now, against your Sky Striker matchup, it's not really the best, but it's kind of okay, as we discussed earlier. Against GoKey, it's great. I mean, again, it's susceptible to being just pretty much shut down by Midbreaker Field, but again, it's not susceptible to Called by the Grave, similar to something like Effect Veiler, so that's something to keep in mind. Against your Altergeist matchup, it's not really that good, and plus they can resolve Multi-Faker off of it, so that's not exactly the best. Draco, it's okay, and Strix Stars, you know, it's not bad. Effect negation really isn't too terrible. I just really love the flexibility of this card depending on what deck that you're playing, because if you're playing something and you're really worried about floodgates, having Impermanence is very nice. And I think Impermanence is going to see a lot more play, especially once Soul Fusion is released and we start seeing Thunder Dragons, because Thunder Dragons can realistically shut down Sky Striker very hard, and in the OCG, when the Sky Strikers were released, a lot of players started playing Infinite Impermanence to counter the Super Thunderbolt Dragon that pretty much shuts down their entire deck. So don't be surprised if Infinite Impermanence starts seeing more play, or even if the price tag starts to increase. Now, last but not least, I want to talk about Psy-Frame Gear Gamma. Now, Gamma is one of those cards that you have to run the risk of playing a card like Psy-Frame Driver, but at the cost of running that brick, you're getting a card that is really, really powerful. I mean, it can negate other hand traps, which is a very strong benefit. It's also something that you can use multiple times, assuming the driver goes to the graveyard the first time you use it. Just really depends on when you use it and if you're able to take advantage of that. And Gamma's also good because it negates and it destroys, so it can play around mid-breaker field for your GoKey matchup. It won't destroy the monster, but negating the effect sometimes might be enough. We start to see some players side decking Gamma, just depending on the matchup. Against your Sky Striker matchup, it's okay. It's kind of nice because the deck is all spells, so if you're playing that deck, you can kind of bait your opponent by getting one of their hand traps, hit them with a Gamma, and then you could maybe sink into Omega and rip a card out of their hand. That'd be pretty sweet. Against GoKey, it's actually one of the strongest hand traps because, again, it plays around mid-breaker field, and if they don't have it, it destroys the monster, which is very important because it stops them from being able to link climb on the later parts of their turn. Against your Altergeist and your True Draco matchup, it's not the best, but it's not the worst either. Like, hitting certain cards could be pretty nice, but ultimately it's something that, you know, it's kind of hit or miss just depending on the circumstances. And against your Strix Star matchup, you know, it's okay as well. Like we said, effect negation's effect negation for what it's worth. If you really just have to weigh the cost of running an extra card like Psy-Frame Driver if you want the power that Gamma does provide. But guys, those are just my thoughts. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think about your thoughts on the new hand traps going into this new format. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always. Subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. And if you found this video informative, consider backing me on Patreon or becoming a YouTube channel member. Because just by showing your support in any way that you can, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.